Okay, welcome to week 3. This week we're going to hear about the evolution of the state and constitution. Last week we heard about the underlying philosophical and the history of ideas and philosophy as it affects British government and politics, some of the underpinning ideas that are still used by modern British politicians, which have been instrumental in evolving the institutions. And today we are going to hear about the evolution of the state and constitution, which will follow on very neatly from last week. And our lecturer today is Professor Martin Laughlin, who is in the Department of Law here at the LSE and who has just very recently published a short and wonderfully readable book on the British Constitution, but I'm sure he will say a word about that in a moment. Martin.
Thank you very much, Tony. I suspect I'm going to give the same story as Paul Kelly. That is, I'm going to talk about the history and the philosophy of the British Constitution from a legal perspective, but not from a technical legal perspective. So although I'm telling the same story, it'll probably be unrecognizable. And that's a consequence of our different disciplinary backgrounds. This is an overview of what I want to talk about. I want to talk, before I talk specifically about the British Constitution, I want to talk about the distinction between ancient and modern ideas of a constitution, and then to talk about the characteristics of the British Constitution, explain the peculiarities, why the British Constitution is unique in the world. It's not unique in the world in being the only unwritten constitution, but it is unique in being the only ancient type of a constitution still in existence. And I want to explain the reasons why and talk a little bit about the implications. I'm really not going to talk about what's going on presently, but I'm happy to address any questions that anyone may wish to raise about that. And I want to start just to out-trump Paul Kelly with the great philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who in his wonderful work, The Philosophy of Spirit, or The Philosophy of Mind, says this: what is called making a constitution is a thing that has never happened in history. For Hegel, it is impossible to make a constitution. Why? Because a constitution is something that evolves from a national, well, very Germanic, develops from a national spirit. A constitution, he's saying, is an expression of the culture and political way of being of a people. It can no more be made than language is made. Language evolves through usage, through intersubjective discussion, and through adaptation, through time, to facilitate the purposes of communication. Sure, we have grammarians who come along every now and again, tidy up the grammar of the subject, but to think that the grammarians are the creators of the language is, Hegel is saying, misconceived. Hegel's writing this in 1830, a late work of Hegel's. Now, in retrospect, we might say that Hegel was wrong. And here I've given you a quotation from Alexander Hamilton writing the first of the Federalist Papers in 1787. The Federalist Papers are this collection by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, 3 participants in the convention that drafts the federal constitution for the United States in 1787. They then produce these journalistic letters, epistles, to convince the voters of New York to ratify the new constitution. And in the first of the Federalist writings, Alexander Hamilton says this: it has been reserved to the people of this country to decide an important question. And that question is whether or not human societies are capable of establishing good government from reflection and from choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. So what Hamilton is saying is that we have made a constitution. The American Federal Constitution of 1787 takes effect as the world's first written modern type of a constitution. And note when Hegel talks about culture and spirit, Hamilton sees accident and force, not culture, but power. And these modern types of constitutions are, of course, the product of the great revolutions of the late 18th century, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and thereafter nations throughout the world have constructed these modern types of constitutions at critical moments in their history. What are the most rudimentary characteristics of these modern types of constitutions? There are lots of characteristics I could draw on, but I want to talk about three of the most basic. First, these modern constitutions are indeed constructions. They are things. They are things that are made. And again, next point, very basic. These things are made by writing them down in a text. So if I ask any citizen of the world, other than here and in Israel and in New Zealand, where's their constitution? They hold up the text and say, here is the Constitution. It's a document which lays down the articles that establish the institutions of government and define the relationship between the institutions of government and their subjects. And the third and final characteristic I would highlight is the innovation that the American Revolution effected, the critical innovation that the American Revolution effected, namely that this Constitution takes effect as fundamental law. Once you have constitutions that are texts that have been drafted, then the lawyers monopolize the game, and the lawyers say, we are the skilled drafters of text. We are the skilled interpreters of rules. We take this Constitution as a legal text. And not only that, these modern constitutions invariably, not always, but they most commonly, especially today, take effect as fundamental law. And what I mean by that is the Constitution establishes the institutions of government, and for our purposes now, most importantly, they establish the legislative authority. They establish a legislature and equip that legislative authority with a competence to make laws. And that legislature makes ordinary laws, laws regulating contractual undertakings, laws regulating acquisition and the disposition of property, laws restricting criminal conduct and such like. That's ordinary law. But the Constitution, understood as a text, is a body of fundamental law because this is the law that establishes the authority of that legislature to make law. So, to change the metaphor a little bit, we have a hierarchy of laws. We have the ordinary laws that a legislature makes, And then we have this special law, the constitutional law, that establishes the authority of the legislature, but also circumscribes it, defines the procedures, defines the relationship between the institutions of state. And therefore, as a consequence of the creation of a modern type of constitution, we see, especially over the last 3 or 4 decades, the emergence of a special new political force, the rise of constitutional jurisdiction, the role of a special institution who claim to act as the guardian of the Constitution. And that special institution is invariably called the Supreme Court, or as in the United States, or in many of the continental European countries, there's a special court established called a Constitutional Court, and the job of that Constitutional Court is to hear cases alleging that some or other public authority has infringed the Constitution. But that public authority can include the legislature itself. Now I highlight that. I highlight these 3 rudimentary characteristics because, of course, none of these exist with respect to the British Constitution. There is no making of a British Constitution in that constructive manner. There is no basic text. There certainly is no concept of fundamental law. Consequently, we find this little statement from Alexis de Tocqueville writing in the classic work Democracy in America, 1835, about not much later than when Hegel was writing, where he says in England, he probably means Britain, come back to that in a moment, significant point. In England, the Constitution may change continually. Or, he concludes, in reality, it does not exist. Already he's absorbed the idea that a constitution must be of a modern type. Already by 1835 he's saying a constitution is something that's been drafted as a text that acquires the status of fundamental law, and if you don't have that bridle on government, then you don't have a constitution. Then he says the constitution doesn't exist in Britain. Why? Because Parliament is at once a legislature and a constituent assembly. What does that mean? What's Tocqueville saying when he says it's a legislature and a constituent assembly?
Is he saying that there's no separation of powers?
No, he's not saying that. We'll come back to separation of powers. That's an important... Well, he's not entirely wrong, but we'll come back to separation of powers, a very important point. Yeah.
It makes the Constitution itself.
Yeah. He's saying that when you have a modern type of constitution made, a special institution is established, a constitutional convention, a constitutional assembly where special delegates are drawn to deliberate and create a constitution. And there's some other institution that is a legislature. And what Tocqueville's saying is that Parliament, today we think of Parliament as a legislature. That's not its, well, it's one of its functions, although the political scientists would tell you otherwise. The political scientists would simply say it legitimates, it doesn't legislate, it doesn't actually deliberate any longer. The government sets the legislative agenda and by and large uses its majority to get through all of its proposals in the form that it desires, but that's a separate issue. What he's saying is that in Parliament you have the whole of the nation assembled. There is no limit on what Parliament can do acting in this constitutional capacity to make law. And that he's expressing this principle, the fundamental legal principle of the British Constitution, the principle of what is generally known as parliamentary sovereignty, the idea that the Crown in Parliament, it's a concept of parliamentary sovereignty, the Crown in Parliament knows no legal limitation on its capacity of action. Whatever law it passes is constitutional, because the Parliament has full authority, and it has that full authority because of this tradition of thinking of the Parliament as composed of delegates of the nation who are authorized to bind. I'll come back and say a word about that at the end, because I'd have to go back and I'd have to revisit the history in order to say that, but let me leave that for one moment. So, why, this is the question I want to ask, why doesn't Britain have a modern type of constitution? The simple answer is that those modern types of constitution are a product of Enlightenment thinking. By Enlightenment, I mean that rationalizing, scientific, secularizing, intellectual spirit that flourished throughout Europe reached its high point in the mid-late 18th century. And it's a consequence of the revolutionary ideas about the constitution of political authority that flourished through the Enlightenment that we have this way of thinking that individuals, we are bearers of natural rights, and we might pool a portion of our natural rights for the collective good, but I think Paul Kelly would have talked about John Locke a little bit. It's this Lockean idea that we pool a portion of our natural rights, but we retain those natural rights that are unnecessary to be pooled, such as freedom of speech, freedom of religious worship, freedom of expression, and so on. We pool that portion for the collective good, but there is a compact, a constitution between the individuals and their institutions of government. This whole sense of the Enlightenment way of thinking about constitutional ordering is a product of 18th century thinking. And then what happens after the French and American revolutions? Nations adopt these new types of constitutions whenever there is an utter collapse of authority, whether through wholesale defeat in a major war, or whether there's a disintegration of empires, because of course up until the 19th century most of the world was, well, and beyond, but up until the 19th century certainly most of the world was organized through imperial structures, not through nation-state structures. So if you have a collapse of an empire like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you have the emergence of nation-states, and at that moment there's a moment of critical rebirth of the state, and they take the opportunity to construct the authority through a modern constitution. Or you have revolutionary insurrection that overthrows the old regime, as we see, of course, in France. Britain hasn't experienced that. Why? Because we're a peaceable people. We don't engage in conflict. We don't engage in revolutionary upheaval. We don't engage in warfare. No, the The problem is the English were so rebellious, they had their revolution too early for this constitutional process. They had their revolution in the 17th century. You go back to the 1640s, the whole decade of the 1640s was a period of intense, bloody civil war. Two main phases, leading in 1649 to a dramatic act, a shocking act, the execution of the king and the formation of a republic, the formation of the Commonwealth. The problem was that the revolutionaries who affected that shocking result still conceived of the necessity for a monarchical figure to maintain political authority. They couldn't conceive of maintaining a stable order without some king figure. And so shortly after the formation of the Commonwealth, Cromwell becomes the Lord Protector. And some of the courtiers say, we want you to take the office of king. Cromwell said, I've got the power, I'm not going to take the office. But what happens is that when Cromwell dies, the system disintegrates because we can't conceive of maintaining this modern type of republic. And 1660, what happens? We restore the monarchy. We have another little revolution, very English revolution in 1688, sometimes called the Glorious Revolution, which is not a revolution in the modern sense. It's well, I can talk about that later if you want, but it's an attempt to restore the principles of the ancient constitution, to restore the order that had been broken by the king's aggressive, Catholic, absolutist, modernizing policies aped on the modernizing ventures of Louis XIV in France. Where am I? Oh, yes. But since the 17th century, we've had upheavals, but we haven't had that moment of utter collapse of the authority structure. And we haven't had the utter collapse through defeat in a total war. And so we have adapted to the changes of modernity through a process I'll say a little more about in a moment. But of course, last point on here, there have been some basic changes to the structure of the state since the 17th century. What's the name of the state we live in? That's an easy question. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Quite a mouthful. You have to think about that because we are a complex, plurinational state that's come into existence through, well, how does it come into existence? We start with 1066. The Norman conquest, it was a conquest. The Normans took over an already relatively stable, highly centralized for its periods, highly centralized English state, and then did what every ruler conscious of statecraft does, maintains the security of that state. How? primarily by subjugating the smaller, lesser nations in the vicinity, to not necessarily through imperial ambition, but merely to maintain the security of their own state. If the Normans, as they were ambitious rulers that had continental claims also, they could not afford to have alliances with the Scots or the Irish, which would lead to armies being raised that would attack them from behind when they were off on some venture in Europe. And so they did what all rulers do. First, they subjugated the Welsh through a brutal policy of conquest. And that process was completed by at least 1535 with the Statute of Wales that incorporates Wales into the English county structure. So we have an English state, but this English state includes Wales. And we have a common law, the English common law, that applies throughout England and Wales. So we have one state there, an English state, that certainly by the 16th century was England and Wales was an English state. Scotland came into the state not through conquest. It came into this, was absorbed into the state by treaty, by the Treaty of Union of 1707. Complicated story. In 1603, we have the Union of the Crowns, when James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. We have throughout most of the 17th century a union of two crowns, King of Scotland, King of England, same person, but two different states. And I'm not going to go into the detail of how that came about now, but but the creation of a new state, Great Britain, was affected by the Treaty of Union of 1707. Scotland has a different legal system. It has a civilian-based legal system based on Roman law, closer to those of continental Europe than to the English common law. So we have a state from 1707 of Great Britain where there's two different legal orders. And the Treaty of Union respects the three bastions of Scots identity, or gives protections to the three bastions of Scots identity, the education system, including the universities, the church. The established church in Scotland is a Presbyterian church, a different church to the established church in England, which is an Anglican church, an Episcopalian church. So two different established churches in this complicated state, and law. Scots law is different to English law. And so we had a new state of Great Britain. The Scots, I hope there aren't any Scots in the audience. In the last 50 years, they've started coming up with this romantic argument that the Treaty of Union is a constitutive treaty that creates a state, and it ought to be acknowledged as a constituent act. Nonsense. All that happened was that the English said to the Scots, I forget the number of MPs, they just said you can have 50 MPs, members of Parliament from Scotland, come to the Westminster Parliament. They didn't even hold general elections. There were no elections in England to reconstitute this state. It was an incorporating treaty. It incorporated Scotland into the essential structure of the English state, which is why when you get classic works that you if you study British government, you will, like Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution, written in 1867. He's not entirely, and neither is de Tocqueville when he says the English. They're saying the essential characteristics of this constitutional order is an English structure. But we can say that through time, there are common characteristics evolve, and we can talk sensibly, and we do talk sensibly about the British Constitution. But then we have the problem of Ireland, which I am not going to go into because that will take all evening and tomorrow and the day after. But let me just say that Ireland had always been the subject of English conquest right from the 13th century, but it's really in the 17th century that attempts are made systematically by the English to colonize Ireland. Anyway, let me cut so there was a dependent parliament in Ireland throughout this period, but for reasons I'll not go into, by the end of the 18th century, it was felt to be unacceptable for this parliament to continue in existence. It wasn't satisfying any of the neither the Irish interest nor the British, and therefore, in the Treaty of Union of 1800, Ireland, the Irish Parliament was abolished, and Ireland was incorporated into the British state to create the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Then, of course, in the beginning of the 20th century, there was, after a 19th century period of home rule claim, there was the Easter Rising during the First World War. There was the War of Independence immediately after the war. There was a civil war in Ireland. The upshot was that Ireland obtained its independence, except for 6 counties in the northeast part of Ireland that which had a Protestant majority and which wanted to remain part of the Union. And so we get the state of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But think about it. You look at all of the subsequent history in the 20th century, certainly at the end of the 20th century, it's quite clear that the position of Northern Ireland is one in which it is accepted on all sides that once and if a majority determine they want to leave the United Kingdom and become part of Ireland, that will happen. So it's not clear to me that we have a United Kingdom constitution, because no state readily accepts that as part of its state. We have a British constitution and a British state, and we have an awkward position of Northern Ireland as part of that British state, but as a remote member part of that state. Well, I spent too long on that. Sorry about that. Once I started talking about the point I'm trying to get at, well, one of the points is that we've got a very complicated state, and from a position of constitutional law, it's a complicated position, especially today when we now have legislative devolution of authority to Scotland and legislative devolution of authority to Northern Ireland, and executive and some incipient forms of legislative delegated authority to Wales, that we've got a complicated pattern from a constitutional legal perspective. that's the messy situation we have with respect to the British constitutional order. And the main reason we don't have a modern constitution, the point I'm trying to accentuate, is that is a product of history. It's circumstantial. But I know Paul talked about Oakeshott, so I'm going to talk about Oakeshott too. There is another element that I want to draw out about the English, and indeed the British. It's very incorrect these days to stereotype an entire nation in this way, but I'm going to. The British are pragmatic, empiricist, distrustful of abstract theory. If a thing works, it's fine. For forms of government, let fools contest, said Alexander Pope. Whatever is governed best is best. Something like that. So there is a philosophical basis for this very, very peculiar ancient lineage of a constitutional order and a constitutional way of thinking. And I think Michael Oakeshott brings this out very, very well indeed. And the reference here is to his classic essay on rationalism in politics. Oakeshott presents it really elegantly. I'm going to present it very, very crudely. I want to make a simple, brief, epistemological point, how we know what we know, and to say, look, there are two types of knowledge. One type of knowledge we all readily understand because we are scholars. We're sitting in an educational establishment. This type of knowledge we readily understand is scientific knowledge. It's the type of knowledge that can be taught and learned. It's the type of knowledge that can be precisely formulated. The epitome of scientific knowledge is to reduce the entire world to quantities, to numbers. The the government department understand it because it's racked down the middle between the quantitative lot who want to transform politics into numbers and I would call them jumblies, but I'm a jumbly myself, so let's call them the hermeneutical, the interpretivists who think there's a thicker texture of interpretation that has to be undertaken in order to understand political engagement. Anyway, I'm off the point. Scientific knowledge is the type of knowledge 2 + 2 = 4. 4 is simply a symbol expressing the product of 2 + 2. But these mathematicians do something a lot more powerful than that with these numbers, and they make sense of the world and they devise scientific laws for understanding the world and predicting behavior and predicting action. In theory, at least. We understand that type of knowledge. The type of knowledge you learn when you come to university and you study the knowledge, the wisdom that is in those books. Oakeshott would say there's another type of knowledge, though. It's practical knowledge. And practical knowledge is the type of knowledge that can't be taught and learned. And it can't be precisely, it's not susceptible to precise formulation. It's the type of knowledge that is only imbibed through experience. It is acquired through training, through experience, through usage. And, well, let me give an illustration simple illustration of practical knowledge, cooking. Apparently, the Great British Bake Off final is tonight. You're probably all wanting to rush home to watch it. I haven't seen it, but my children are. Anyway, irrelevant. No, it's not irrelevant. It's cooking. What is the knowledge that is acquired by a good cook? How do they acquire this knowledge? And what I want to suggest is that cooking is a good illustration of this idea of practical knowledge. Well, let me illustrate it by a crude example. I'm an intelligent, rational, thinking being. I can read. I walk across the road to the bookshop there, and I buy the Cordon Bleu cookbook, and I crack it open at page 44, and on the right-hand side there's this wonderful color picture of a fantastic dish, a souffle or something. And on the left-hand side, there's 5 easy steps for how to make the souffle. And I get the ingredients, I mix them up, I follow the quantities, I put them in the oven, whisk the stuff, put it in the oven, bring it out at the right moment. It doesn't look anything like the picture. Now, but why doesn't it look anything like the picture? The reason is quite simple. I've misunderstood the nature of the enterprise, the activity. Cooking is a practical knowledge acquired through experience. Unless you have the skill, the art of what it is to be a good cook, you can't achieve your objectives. The cookbook is merely a crib. The cookbook is an essential crib because once you have that knowledge, once you have that experience, you don't keep all the detailed stuff in your head. You just refer to it. So you can use the cookbook effectively only when you have the practical knowledge of what it is to be a good cook. And what Oakeshott would say is the error of rationalism is the assumption that there is only one type of knowledge. Of course, there isn't 2 types of knowledge, but knowledge is complicated. It's on a spectrum. And at some end of the spectrum, there is scientific knowledge. 2 + 2 = 4. The other end of the spectrum, there's practical knowledge through experience. And we have to understand where on this spectrum the activity sits from this epistemological position. So, what's the point? What am I rattling on about? Yeah. What I'm rattling on about first is this. In the English legal tradition, we have a tradition of law rooted in the common law. What does the common law mean? Well, it means lots of things, but for our purposes, it means unwritten law. Lex non scripta, to use the fancy Latin formulation. It's not written down. That doesn't mean to say that judges don't write judgments and write them down and we study the judgments. But what it does mean is that the source of knowledge is not in the text. And that's reflected in our traditions of legal education. The great medieval universities of Europe all were founded with theology, medicine, and law at their core. Not so in England. Law was an unfit subject for university study in England because the common law was an exercise of practical knowledge. So the young gentlemen who went to the Oxford and Cambridge colleges didn't study mathematics or natural sciences or medicine or classics. And then they did what? They went across the road here to the Inns of Court and were apprenticed to a pupil master. And they spent years in apprenticeship understanding the arts of drafting, of pleading, of litigating, from just acting as a bag carrier for a pupil master. And they sometimes spent years before they ever got cases on their own to plead. It was practical training in the practical knowledge, the experience, the artificial reason of the common law, as one of our great old 17th century Chief Justices, Coke, called it. And then after 20 or 30 years of practice at the bar, they became High Court judges, and through that experience, they delivered judgments. I say to my law students, what are you doing here studying law at university? The knowledge of law is not here in the books. It's practical knowledge. Actually, what's happened is it's been rationalized. We've seen in the 20th century the growth of university legal education, but it is a 20th century phenomenon. Okay, but you haven't come here to hear me talk about the English common law. What's the relevance of this to understanding the Constitution? The Constitution, the British Constitution, is an unwritten constitution. It's the extension of the mentality, the culture of the common law to the practice of governing. I talked about the gentlemen who went to the Oxford and Cambridge colleges, and I mean gentlemen, to the Oxford and Cambridge colleges and into the Inns of Court to be apprenticed to pupils and then acquiring the status as barristers. And what happens to them is not simply that they spend 20 or 30 years going to practice and then going off to be a High Court judge. Some of them do, but some of them, before that point, inherit their father's title and go off to the House of Lords. And the poor younger sons of those families inherit the constituency, and they become the representative of the constituency in the House of Commons. And they have all been educated in the same traditions of rule. This is what Bagehot calls club government. When you're in a club and everybody knows one another and everybody understands the mentality and the practices and the art of what it is to govern and to govern well, you don't need to have extensive rules written down saying do this and do not do that. You imbibe this tradition of conduct, which is why Gladstone rightly said in the 19th century, the public schools of England are part of the Constitution, because you don't get your education from, it's too late if you're just going off to Oxford and Cambridge colleges, you get your education from going to the great public schools of England from the age of 8 or whatever. And it's that tradition that makes sense of the British Constitution. The problem we have, the problem we have, of course, is that since, well, let's just arbitrarily pick the beginning of the 20th century, we have the rise of democracy. We have the formation of political parties on programs leading to ideological politics, scientific politics, the politics of the rule book, whether your rule book is taken from Hayek or Bentham or Marx, it's a rule book. This is This is the good, and our job is to promote the good. And we have then the growth of rationalist politics, ideological politics, the politics of party and program, in a constitutional edifice that is anti-rationalist in its structure. And we perceive the problems throughout the 20th century. The Labour Party historically was not interested in constitutional reform because, as far as they were concerned, once you get the majority in the House of Commons, there's no limit to what can be achieved. And therefore, the old ancient constitution suits us well, they'll say. The Conservatives think they're in the inheritors of the group that's born to rule, and yeah, we will keep to the traditional ways. The Liberals at the beginning of the 20th century, of course, dabbled and tried to bring about modernization of the Constitution through the crisis over the budget in 1909 and the Parliament Act and so on, but then lost out in the creation of the two-party structure. And it's only since the end of that two-party, clear divide, ideological, political structure of British party politics, that is the last, well, since the rise of New Labour, I suppose, that we have this discussion of, oh, maybe our old inherited constitution is no longer effective and workable. I said I was going to go back and address your question about the separation of powers. I'm not sure I should. I just want, well, okay, 2 minutes and then I'll stop. I'm happy then to address any questions you might have about it, what I've said. Let me replay the whole of the history of British government from this perspective, Not, well. You start with the figure of the king. The king, though, does not just exercise personal rule. Even by the 13th century, it was accepted, it was recognized that there was a differentiation between the person of the king and the office of the king, between the king and his crown. The crown comes to stand as the symbol of the authority of the state. The king in his public capacity, not his personal capacity. And that gives rise to all this the medieval jurists talking about the king's two bodies. And the king is dead, long live the king, because the medieval jurists would say, you and I as natural persons have one body. We are born, we live, we die. The king has two bodies. The natural body, but the king also has a body politic, a political body. And this political body lives on in him in perpetuity. And it was invented by the medieval jurists to ensure the stability of authority in a period of the death of a king. We don't wait for the ritual of coronation to create a new king. The king, once the king is dead, the rules of succession will determine who the next king is. That's a sideline. I wasn't intending to talk about the king's two bodies. I wanted to talk about the king and the crown. Magna Carta 1215. Vitally important, but nobody can understand what Magna Carta was really about unless they are immersed in medieval history, because it was mostly about feudal rights. The critical constitutional point is that what the what the barons achieved at Magna Carta was to say the king can exercise royal will only through an institutional form, only through his council. So the king's will is not what King John decreed when he got up out of bed in the morning. The king's will could only be formulated through his council. And that was attested by seals. So you have the Lord Chancellor as the keeper of the Great Seal of State, and the Lord Privy Seal, the holder of the King's private seal. But unless these documents were sealed, there was no official will, and the seal would only be affixed when the king had deliberated in council. So you have the construction of an institutional will. The king in council was the sovereign. And that was an early achievement, and it institutionalized authority. And then the king realized that there were really vital, important interests of state for which it would be helpful to bind the rest of the nation. And so the king, I was going to say invited. Kings do not invite. Kings sent out a demand to the 40 counties of England to send 2 representatives of each of the 40 counties to come to meet in the Great Council of State. These 2 knights of the shires were sent to London to meet with the king in council in Parliament. And this is the roots of the Parliament, where you get the representatives of across the nation to meet with the king in council to it's not a democratic movement. It's to bind the nation, because the king wanted to engage in some ambitious policy of warfare that would require the levying of taxes. And you then need to get binding commitment from everybody in the nation to pay up. And this is the way in which it was done. But this route although it was perceived as a burden by anybody who had to go off to Parliament, and because there's no choice. You couldn't say, excuse me, I don't think going to war against France is a good idea. That's not really what this Parliament was about. It was about ensuring that the king's writ ran, the king's will was done. But from those early origins, we get, through an elaborate process of institutional formation and differentiation, a very strong system of rule. The point I wanted to make is this. I think Paul, I looked at his slide, referred to Montesquieu, Spirit of the Laws, the classic chapter where he talks about the Constitution of England, and he talks about the Constitution of England being the one constitution that promotes liberty. Why does it promote liberty? Because of the separation of powers. Rubbish. Montesquieu got it dead wrong. What was the strength of the British system of government was not a separation. There was a differentiation of power, but the strength of government was through this intricate, multi-layered system, but was an integrated system. We talk about the Crown in Parliament being the highest authority. Strictly, it's the Crown in Council in Parliament, because all of the members of the Council are members of the Parliament, and that's a structure that stays with us today. We have a system of parliamentary government where all the members of the government must be a member of one or other of the Houses of Parliament. And it's that intricacy of connection that was the strength of British government, not the separation. To the extent that our highest court, up until we lost our way a few years ago, our highest court was a committee of the second chamber of the legislature, if you want to put it in modern. The Judicial Committee of the House of Lords was the highest court. And that was because we've lost our way. We thought, well, it's offensive. These Europeans don't understand what we're about. So let's, a very British reform, we pick them up and we take them across Parliament Square and we put them into a courthouse and we call them a Supreme Court. They do exactly the same thing in the same way. There was no problem. The conventions worked, but it was not felt in the Council of Europe to be sensible when, I don't know, Kyrgyzstan was saying, well, the Brits have judges who are who are part of the government. Why can't we? So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is our history is a peculiar history. It's a unique history. It's singular today, but it's one that we really don't have much faith in any longer because none of us understand the logic of the British Constitution and British constitutional law. And so we're showing how feeble we are as a people by accommodating ourselves to this liberal, democratic, constitutionalist, rights-based rhetoric that requires us to ape the structures of these modern constitutional templates. On that happy note, I will stop.
All right, thank you, Martin, for that fascinating glimpse into a wide range of aspects of the UK's constitutional arrangements, and indeed what I'd like to do is, before I bring our three students who are going to ask some questions this afternoon in, I'd just like to start by your obvious small c conservative concern about what you described there, talking about the separation of powers. Before the House of Lords, or the committee of the House of Lords that became the Supreme Court, before it was moved across Parliament Square to Middlesex Guildhall, so you've got the judiciary and effectively the legislature and the executive all, in a sense, in the same institution. That's to some extent, isn't it? You've got Parliament providing ministers who form the executive and the judiciary all in one institution. I mean, you sounded as if you were sad that that had ended. I mean, isn't that, you can see why people might have thought that that arrangement was a bit cosy, not only not a separation of powers, but, you know, unusual, even by unusual standards.
Yeah. Sorry, what I didn't say, of course, what I should have said, Tony, I just get carried away at the end. The unifying force remains the Crown, because the judges are Her Majesty's judges. They are appointed by prerogative power of Her Majesty. The Parliament is convened by writ of Her Majesty and is dissolved by prerogative writ of Her Majesty. And the peers that sit in the second chamber are made peers of the realm by an exercise of prerogative power. So what we have is a legal constitutional frame that is medieval in form. So we have a simple top-down structure of legal authority, but we've created a quite intricate constitution because it's legally simple and false, and it's highly complicated in practice through a set of political practices and political understandings about how this system works. I was being provocative, and I was being provocative in saying it's a sad day when myself, well, I'd be happy to rip the whole thing up, but the sort of reforms that I would have in mind are just not on the cards. I think the state of the House of Lords is an absolute disgrace, but we've spent 10 years tinkering with it, and it's worse than it was 10 years ago. Well, it isn't worse than it was, but it's ironic. The only elected element of the House of Lords are the hereditary peers, because we got rid of hereditary peerage of rights sitting in the House of Lords, and we now say to the 600 peers of the realm, elect 95 of your number and come and sit there. So at least they're being elected by some peculiar franchise, but otherwise it's stuffed full of party apparatchiks. That just it's offensive. But so I would replace it with a Council of State. Right. But so I have a template for a change, but I don't see any point in talking about it because if you're going to do constitutional reform, do it properly. Most of the, and don't leave it to governments. Governments are the worst institutions to be. They have no desire to give up any of their power, so they're not prepared to institute any constitutional change that will result in challenging their own position.
But that must mean in our system, logically, it can never be changed then. I mean, that's all effectively what you're saying.
Alternative?
Revolution, okay. All right. Now, Roman, Diana, Joe, you were going to start off with some questions this afternoon. Which of the three of you would like to go first? And speak nice and loud when you speak so we can all hear.
So I read your very short introduction to the British Constitution, and you spoke about the arguments that, well, at least the parameters that Payne puts forward with regard to what constitutes a democracy. And one of them is that since the Constitution is antecedent to a government cannot write the Constitution, therefore the people must write the Constitution. But to my knowledge, I'm American. The American Constitution was written by older white rich men in a secluded part of the Northeast.
Northeast is good. Sorry.
No, but
he comes from the Northeast here.
What I mean is that it's always been a very elite group of people who have written constitutions, and with the LSC's goal of crowdsourcing in a constitution that they're doing right now, do you think that it's a? Do you think the people are the best people to write their own constitution? Do you think the common man is the best person to? It might imbue the document with the most democratic legitimacy possible. But do you think the people know what to write in terms of a constitution?
It's a really good question. Are the people who should write constitutions, or if they did so, what would be the consequences of doing that?
It's a very good question, for which I can give a very brief answer, and the answer is no. The people, no, of necessity. I don't know what Connor's on. I love Connor dearly.
This is Connor Gearty, who is crowdsourcing the Constitution.
It is impossible for writing a constitution, making a constitution is a very serious business, but it can't be achieved by consensus. Why not? Because the whole objective of a constitution is to create a framework within which must of necessity accommodate quite different political perspectives on what the good is. And therefore, if you're trying to build a constitution on a unanimity of value, it's doomed from the start. Making a constitution, like every other intricate task, is an elite task. You draft a constitution and you sell it. That's what Alexander Hamilton was doing in the Federalist Papers. They sold a constitution. It's got tremendous flaws in it. It's now a sacred document that can't be changed, as you know. But who now would appoint, Supreme Court justices for life? No one in their right mind. It's a crazy system. Why does California only have 2 representatives, and I don't know, Delaware have 2 senators? Why are the citizens of Washington disenfranchised. You know, there's lots of problems in the American constitutional system. Anyway, off the point. No. And Rousseau, back to, I don't know if Paul mentioned Rousseau last week, but Rousseau was the first to put his finger on this paradox. If you write a constitution in the name of we the people, because the people, in inverted commas, that comes into existence as the authorizing agent of a constitution is a construct that's created only by the social contract. Of necessity, look at the Hobbesian state of nature where you've got a perpetual war of all against all. Well, how did that, if that's the picture, how do they reason to a position where they agree rationally to create any sort of authority structure, let alone the Hobbesian construct, but any authority? You can't. It's a fiction, the idea that the people have created this constitution. The concept of the people is the collective rational will that we use to keep the game in play, the constitutional game in play, so that somehow it has to, the constitution and the political game has to continue to work in a way that the people do not rise up and say, not in our name, we're pulling the whole edifice down. So you keep it up and running in the name of the people, but the people, as the crowd, the multitude, the many, well, as Machiavelli says, the people can't think, but they can feel. That is, they can't make a constitution, but they can sure as hell bring one down if they are saying a plague on all your system. You can see why the social media works so well then, can't you? Now, Diana, you were going to ask something or make a comment.
Yeah, so jumping on...
Speak out nice and loud too.
So jumping on the idea of a people-made constitution, mine is less of a theoretical question, I suppose. But do you see a tension between the fundamental principle of the British Constitution, which would be parliamentary sovereignty, between that and popular sovereignty? So, for example, the increased use of referenda in British politics today, do you see that as sort of parliamentary sovereignty being relinquished in the UK, or?
So are referenda reducing parliamentary sovereignty?
It's a good question, and it's quite clear that the growing use of referendums is a symptom of the collapse of that traditional constitutional order. We no longer think of Parliament as the mirror of the nation, as having all power incorporated in it. So we just as the King in council went to the Knights of the Shires and bound them to government policy, so too governments today are using referendums to bind the people to the policies they want to promote. And I say it that way around because referendums are not democratic devices. A referendum is an expression of a democratic temperament only when the conditions for the referendum are clearly and explicitly laid out in the constitutional document, so it's triggered by a prior event. But in our system, governments use referendums when they want to use referendums, so it's a tool of government policy. It's trying to bind the nation. It's trying to establish its authority. The Conservatives are going to have a referendum on in-out on Europe, perhaps. Why? To bind their to bind their party, which is otherwise going to be torn apart on this question. But it's very little to do.
And that's what Harold Wilson did in 1975, isn't it? We had one in 1975 for exactly the same reason, wasn't it? To effectively for him to bind the Labour Party at that point. Joe.
Okay. So even if a modern constitution were desirable or necessary, which I'm not convinced is the case, I mean, would it actually be practical to put one together? I mean, you know, do we just have too many traditions and institutions in our ancient constitution that would be impossible to codify? I mean, could we account for all the court elites or other obscure remnants of feudalism? the eccentricities of local government in the City of London, the Isles of Scilly, or good heavens, Sark. I mean, yeah, you know, do these obscurities actually prevent a scientific approach to the Constitution?
So is it really ever possible to reform and create a written constitution, get away from our existing arrangements?
At one level, yes, of course we could, because constitutions don't have to deal with all minutiae of government. Constitutions can, if there's the will, express the fundamental elements of political order and leave all the minutiae and the detail to normal political processes. And so they, in a true sense, they should be erecting the central institutions and the terms on which they operate, and laying down the essential framework of principles under which public power is exercised. So it could incorporate those ritualistic feudal hangovers. But there is a more fundamental problem about why we today could not have a written constitution. Crazy institutions like the IPPR and
These are
think tanks have been drafting these. You can go. The IPR wrote down the basic rules of the Constitution. Well, I don't understand the point, but they're not the only one. There's a few that have done. Richard Gordon, who's a QC, a barrister, has also produced one on the similar. There is, though, a fundamental problem. We can't write a constitution because, however fictional it is, we have to start by asking the question who we are. And we can't do that. Next year, the Scots are going to have a referendum on whether they, not the Scots, the 5 million people who live in Scotland presently, well, many of whom are English, and there are many Scots here, crazy.
Well, you don't mean it's crazy having the Scots here, you mean it's crazy they can't vote, I'm taking is what you mean.
We are a plurinational system, so leaving it to one bit of territorially of who happens to be resident in that territory at any. Well, I've lived in Scotland. One of my daughters was born in Scotland. She didn't get a vote. Anyway, but who are we? Unless our symbol. There was a poll done a few years ago which asked the Germans what they were most proud of in their public identity. The answer was their constitution. And the same poll was undertaken for Britain, and the answer, the Queen.
Good note to end on. We must end because others are about to arrive. I'm sorry those of you who wanted to ask questions. We'll try and do better for you next week. Next week, we are on to the development of modern British government with Professor Kate Jenkins. Look forward to seeing you the same time next week. Thank you, Martin Loughlin.